Did you know that the single most famous piece of fishing advice ever given is probably the exact reason you are not catching fish right now? Picture this. You just arrived at the lake, the wind is howling, and you immediately point your boat right into the crashing waves because your grandpa always told you to fish into the wind. But what if I told you that doing this in the month of May is essentially throwing your entire fishing trip in the garbage? Today, we are talking about why the old fish into the wind rule is actually destroying your spring fishing success. I'm going to reveal the unexpected truth about what is really happening under the water when that wind blows, and why turning your back on this golden rule will instantly help you catch more fish. So, let me ask you a question before we start. Have you ever spent 8 hours getting beat up by the wind just to go home skunked? Tell me about it in the comments and let us figure out why. To understand why this is such a massive problem, we have to look at why this rule exists in the first place. This advice has been passed down for generations. It is carved into the walls of every local bait shop in the country. The belief is simple. The wind pushes the microscopic food across the lake. The small baitfish follow the food, and the giant predator fish follow the baitfish right up to the windy shoreline. Because this logic sounds so good, millions of fishermen do the exact same thing year after year. They fight the waves, they struggle to cast, and they force themselves to fish in terrible conditions because they think they have to. We hold on to these old habits like they are an absolute law of nature, completely ignoring the fact that fishing conditions change drastically depending on the season. Picture this. It is 6 in the morning, you just arrived at your favorite lake. The sun is barely peeking over the trees, and there is a stiff breeze blowing right into the boat ramp. For as long as you have held a fishing rod, you have heard the exact same advice from your dad, your grandpa, and every old-timer at the local bait shop. Always fish into the wind. They told you the wind pushes the bait, and the big predators follow the bait right up to the bank. So, you point your boat directly into those rolling waves. You pull your hat down tight. You start casting right into the teeth of that breeze. But 2 hours go by. Your shoulders ache, your casting reel has backlashed 3 times, and your live well is completely empty. You sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and look out at the choppy water, wondering what went wrong. You followed the golden rule of fishing, right? Well, let me tell you something that might sting a little bit. That old golden rule is exactly what is ruining your May fishing trips. We hold on to these old sayings like they are gospel, never stopping to think if they actually apply to the specific season or conditions we are facing right now. Let us break down exactly why that old advice even exists in the first place. You are out there on the water, the wind is howling, and you are trying to make sense of it. The traditional logic actually sounds pretty solid when you hear it over a cold drink at the marina. The theory goes that wind creates surface currents. Those currents sweep microscopic plankton across the lake, pushing it all against the wind-blown shoreline. Then, the small baitfish follow the plankton buffet. Finally, the big trophy fish follow the baitfish. It is the circle of life, right? You can almost imagine the feeding frenzy happening right there in the crashing waves. And to be fair, in the middle of autumn, this pattern is often dead on. But fishing is not a math equation that stays the same all year round. What works in October can absolutely destroy your chances in the late spring. The mistake we make is treating all wind and all seasons exactly the same. We ignore the subtle changes happening under the surface. When you sit on the bank and watch the waves crash, you have to realize that the underwater world in May is playing by a completely different set of rules. So, what is really happening in the month of May? Think about a typical spring morning on the water. The birds are singing, the trees are finally green, and the fish are in a massive state of transition. Depending on where you live, They are either getting ready to spawn, actively spawning, or just finishing up the process. This is the most stressful and exhausting time of the year for them. They are not roaming the open water looking for a wind-blown buffet. They are looking for stability. They want hard bottoms, protected areas, and consistent water temperatures. Now, imagine a heavy wind blowing straight into a shallow cove where these fish are trying to do their thing. The wind stirs up the bottom. It creates chaos in the shallows. The very last thing a tired, post-spawn fish wants to deal with is a washing machine of muddy, turbulent water. They do not want to fight heavy currents just to hold their position. So, what do? They leave. They abandon those wind-blown banks that your grandpa told you to fish, and they retreat to deeper water or slide into heavily protected pockets where the water is calm and quiet. Let us talk about water temperature, because this is the absolute biggest factor that nobody talks about at the boat ramp. In the springtime, you are constantly searching for warmer water. Even a difference of 2 or 3 degrees can turn a terrible day of fishing into the best day of your life. When the sun beats down on a quiet, protected cove, that shallow water warms up quickly. The fish flock to that warmth like people gathering around a campfire. Now, what happens when you have a stiff breeze blowing right into that same shallow bank? That wind creates a constant mixing effect. It pulls cooler water from the main lake and pushes it straight into your honey hole. It mixes the warm surface water with the colder water underneath. Suddenly, that beautiful warm spot drops 5 degrees in a matter of hours. You are standing there on the front deck, casting your favorite lure into the wind, thinking you are doing the right thing. But the fish have already felt the temperature drop. They shut their mouths, lock down on the bottom, or move away entirely. You are literally fishing in the coldest, least active part of the lake, simply because you followed an old wives' tale. Have you ever cast your line into a wind-blown bank in May, only to realize the water looks like chocolate milk? That brings us to the problem of water clarity. When a strong wind beats against a muddy or clay bank, it completely destroys the visibility. The waves erode the shoreline, pulling thick silt and dirt out into the water. Now, imagine you are a predator fish trying to hunt in that mess. In the spring, fish rely heavily on their eyesight to track down a quick meal, especially when they are guarding fry or recovering from the spawn. If they cannot see your lure from more than 3 inches away, your chances of getting a bite drop to almost 0. You might feel a tap on your line, set the hook, and come up empty because the fish completely missed the bait in the mud. I have seen guys spend hours working a heavily stained, wind-blown bank, getting more and more frustrated with every cast. They think the fish just are not hungry. But the truth is, the fish simply cannot see a thing. Meanwhile, just around the corner, on the calm side of the lake, the water is clear, the sun is shining, and the fish are actively feeding. Now, let us get incredibly real about the physical act of fishing into the wind. We have all been there. You tie on a light spring lure, maybe a weightless plastic worm or a small crankbait. You wind up, put all your strength into the cast, and fire it straight into a 20-mile-per-hour headwind. What happens next is the stuff of nightmares. The lure stops in midair like it hit an invisible brick wall. Your baitcaster's spool keeps spinning. Suddenly, you are staring at a bird nest so bad you need a pair of scissors to fix it. You spend the next 15 minutes picking at loops of line while you drift aimlessly away from your spot. Even if you use spinning gear, the wind catches your line, creating a massive bow. You cannot feel your lure hitting the bottom. You cannot feel a subtle bite. A fish could inhale your bait, chew on it, and spit it out before you ever saw your line twitch. You are completely disconnected from what is happening at the end of your rod. Fishing is supposed to be about feeling that magical thump. But when you are fighting a heavy wind, you are just blindly dragging plastic through the water, hoping for a miracle. And what about boat control? If you are fishing from a boat or a kayak, fishing directly into the wind is an absolute nightmare. Let us paint the picture. You are trying to quietly approach a shallow flat. You know the fish are spooky in the springtime, but because the wind is pushing you away, you have to keep your trolling motor on high just to maintain your position. The prop is churning water, creating a massive underwater racket. You are stomping on the pedal, trying to keep your balance as the waves rock the boat back and forth. You might as well be marching a brass band through the shallows. The fish can hear that trolling motor humming and vibrating long before you ever get close enough to make a cast. By the time your lure hits the water, every fish within a 50-yard radius is on high alert. I was out last week and watched a guy fighting the wind so hard, he actually crashed the nose of his boat into a lay-down tree. He spooked every fish in the cove. If you are spending 80% of your mental energy just trying to steer the boat, you are not focused on reading the water or presenting your bait properly. So where are the fish actually hiding while you are out there getting beat up by the waves? In the month of May, you need to start looking at the protected zones. Think about those quiet, calm coves where the surface looks like a sheet of glass. When you glide into one of these protected pockets, the first thing you notice is the peace and quiet. The water is clear. You can see the bluegill darting around the shallow cover. You can see the aquatic grass starting to grow. This is where the magic happens. The water here is stable, warm, and full of life. This is where fish go to rest, to spawn, and to hunt without expending unnecessary energy. You make a long, effortless cast. Your lure lands with a quiet splash. You watch your line slowly sink, and you can feel absolutely every pebble on the bottom. Suddenly your line jumps. You set the hook, and the rod bends double. This is what spring fishing is supposed to feel like. You are not fighting the elements. You are working with the natural layout of the lake. Leaving the wind-blown banks behind is sometimes all it takes to turn a frustrating morning into an unforgettable day on the water. Let us talk a little more about baitfish, because the old-timers always focus on the bait. Yes, wind pushes plankton, and yes, shad will follow that plankton. But in May, baitfish behave very differently than they do in the fall. In the spring, many baitfish species are focused on their own spawning rituals. They are looking for shallow, protected cover, not wandering aimlessly in the open water wind currents. Shad, for example, will often spawn early in the morning along hard edges, concrete walls, or riprap banks, regardless of which way the wind is blowing. If you are blindly following the wind because you think the bait is there, you might be driving right past massive schools of spawning shad in completely calm water. I remember a morning a few years ago. The wind was howling out of the north. I beat the windy banks for 3 hours without a single bite. Finally, I tucked into a calm marina to get out of the chop. The water was perfectly still, and the surface was absolutely boiling with shad. The predator fish had them pinned against the docks. I caught a fish on almost every cast, all because I stopped listening to the old wind rule. Another myth we need to bust right now is the idea of oxygenation. You hear it all the time. The old guys will say that the wind chops up the surface and adds oxygen to the water, which makes the fish more active. Now, there is some truth to that, but context is everything. In the dead of summer, in late August, when the water is 85 degrees and stagnant, yes, a strong wind can be a lifesaver. It breaks the thermocline and pumps desperately needed oxygen into the shallows. But we are talking about May. In the spring, the water temperatures are still relatively cool and highly oxygenated naturally. The fish are not struggling to breathe. They do not need a 20-knot wind to wake them up. In fact, all that extra wind and wave action in the spring just creates unnecessary turbidity and stress. It is like turning on a massive fan in your living room during the middle of winter. You do not need the air circulation. You just want to stay warm and comfortable. When you understand the science of water conditions in the spring, you start to realize why forcing yourself to fish into the wind is often a complete waste of your valuable time. Think about the lures you are throwing in the spring. May is prime time for finesse fishing. We are talking about wacky-rigged worms, lightweight jigs, floating frogs, and topwater walkers. These baits are designed to be fished with precision. You want them to dance and pause, coaxing a strike out of a fish that might be guarding a bed or holding tight to a submerged stump. When you try to fish these finesse baits into a strong headwind, the presentation is completely ruined. Your topwater frog gets swamped by the rolling waves. Your lightweight worm gets dragged unnaturally across the bottom by the huge bow in your line. You lose all the subtle action that actually triggers the bite. A wacky worm is supposed to flutter down slowly, wiggling at both ends. But in heavy wind currents, it just looks like a stick being swept away by a storm. If you want to use the most effective spring baits, you absolutely must find water that allows you to present them correctly. And 9 times out of 10, that means turning your back on the wind or finding a completely sheltered area where you have total control over your lure and your fishing line. Picture the boat ramp at around 3 in the afternoon. You pull your truck up, and there are half a dozen other fishermen strapping down their boats. Everyone looks tired, sunburned, and frustrated. You walk over and ask how the bite was. The answers are always the same. Man, it was tough out there today. The wind was just brutal. We could not get anything going. They all spent the entire day fighting the exact same wind-blown banks, getting their teeth kicked in by the waves. They all followed the old-school advice, and they all have empty coolers to show for it. It is almost like a badge of honor for some guys. They think if they do not suffer out there in the roughest water, they are not really fishing. But fishing is not a suffering contest. It is a puzzle. And the guys who are quietly loading up heavy stringers of fish are the ones who solve the puzzle by adapting. They saw the heavy wind, knew it would destroy the shallow spring bite, and completely changed their game plan. They did not complain about the weather at the ramp because they used their heads and found the fish hiding exactly where the old rules said they would not be. So, how do you actually read the water on a breezy May morning? It all comes down to understanding the layout of the lake and how the wind interacts with the underwater structure. Instead of looking for the bank that is taking a direct hit from the waves, start looking for secondary points and the sides of coves. Imagine a large bay that opens up to the main lake. If the wind is blowing straight in, the very back of that bay is going to be a muddy, turbulent mess. But the sides of that bay, the areas that are getting a glancing blow or no wind at all, those are your transition zones. The fish will move out of the muddy chaos in the back and stage on those side points. You pull up to a point where the calm water meets the choppy water. There is a distinct mud line where the clear water ends. You position your boat in the calm water and cast out toward the edge. You are using the wind to your advantage now, without getting punished by it. You are intercepting the fish that are trying to escape the exact conditions your grandfather told you to fish in. That is how you turn a miserable, windy day into a masterclass in spring fishing. Now, I want to be fair. Is there ever a time in May when fishing into the wind actually works? Yes, but it comes with a massive warning label. The only time you really want to seek out wind-blown banks in the spring is when you have a strong, sustained warm front blowing in from the south. If the air temperature has been hot for 3 days and a warm southern breeze is blowing across the lake, that warm surface water gets pushed against the bank. In that very specific scenario, the wind can actually raise the water temperature in the shallows and trigger a feeding frenzy. But how often does that actually happen during your weekend trips? Most of the time in the spring, we are dealing with nasty, cold front winds blowing out of the north or northwest. These cold winds drop the air temperature, drop the water temperature, and completely shut down the bite on the windward banks. You have to look at the weather forecast and understand what kind of wind you are dealing with. If it makes you want to put on a jacket, you better believe those spring fish are going to hate it just as much as you do. Stop treating all wind like it is magic. Let us talk to the fly fishermen and the ultra-light tackle guys for a minute. If you are out there throwing tiny hair jigs, crappy magnets, or trying to roll cast a floating fly, the old wind advice is incredibly toxic. Fly fishing in a headwind is not just frustrating, it is practically dangerous. You have heavy tungsten flies flying past your ears at supersonic speeds. Your leader is tied up in knots, and your presentation looks terrible. The beauty of light tackle fishing is the finesse, the delicate splashdown, and the visual excitement of seeing a fish swipe at your bug. When you force yourself to fish the windy side of the lake, you strip away every single advantage your lightweight gear gives you. I have watched guys completely ruin their expensive fly lines trying to punch through a spring gale. Why do that to yourself? Take your boat or walk your waders around to the lee side of the island. Find that glassy water where you can watch a bluegill sip a dry fly right off the surface. Fishing is supposed to be fun, not a grueling test of your physical endurance and your ability to untangle knots. One of the best strategies you can employ in May is targeting the shadows and the laydowns in calm water. When the sun gets high, fish want cover. They tuck under boat docks, slide into the middle of fallen trees, and hang out in the shade of overhanging bushes. To catch these fish, you need pinpoint accuracy. You have to skip your jig right under that pontoon boat, or pitch your plastic worm directly into the center of a massive brush pile without getting snagged. Try doing that with the wind blowing 30 miles an hour in your face. It is impossible. Your bait sails 2 feet to the left, wraps around a rusty dock cable, and you lose your favorite lure. But when you ignore the wind advice and seek out the sheltered areas, you regain your accuracy. You can pick apart a fallen tree branch by branch. You can drop your bait silently right in front of a resting bass. The control you have over your presentation in calm water is the absolute key to catching fish during the post-spawn transition. The guys who catch fish consistently are the ones who can put their bait in the exact spot it needs to be every single time. If you do not believe me, just look at what modern electronics are showing us. Back in the day, the old-timers gave advice based on gut feelings and surface observations. They saw waves crashing and assumed the fish were there. Today, we have forward-facing sonar and incredibly detailed fish finders. The screen does not lie. When you pan that transducer across a wind-pounded shallow bank in the middle of a May cold front, the screen is a ghost town. There is nothing but swirling mud and debris. But when you turn the boat around and scan the calm, deep edge of a protected point, the screen lights up like a Christmas tree. You can literally watch the fish stacked up, holding tight to cover, completely ignoring the wind-blown buffet that the old myths promised. Technology has allowed us to peek behind the curtain. We no longer have to guess where the fish are based on 50-year-old rumors. We can see them. And what we are seeing is that fish in the spring avoid turbulent, muddy, cold water at all costs. It is time we update our mental rulebooks to match the reality of what is actually happening below the surface. We also need to discuss the physical and mental toll of fighting the weather. Fishing is a mental game. When you are confident, focused, and relaxed, you fish better. You notice the subtle twitch of your line. You make better decisions on when to change colors or retrieve speeds. But when you spend 5 hours getting beaten to a pulp by freezing wind and whitecap waves, you lose your edge. Your hands are numb. Your back hurts from fighting the trolling motor. You start making lazy casts. You stop paying attention to your line. You fall into a mindless rhythm, just hoping the day ends soon. You cannot expect to catch the biggest fish of your life when you are in a state of sheer misery. Moving to calmer water is not just about finding active fish, it is about preserving your own sanity and endurance. When you are comfortable, you can stay on the water longer. You can focus on the tiny details that trigger a bite. I would rather fish an area with half as many fish if it means I can comfortably and perfectly present my bait to them, rather than blindly casting into a hurricane where I cannot feel a thing. So how do we rebuild our spring fishing strategy from the ground up? It starts the night before your trip. You look at the weather app. You check the wind direction and the wind speed. If you see a heavy front moving in, you immediately pull up your lake map. You start drawing circles around the coves, bays, and creeks that will be naturally protected from that specific wind direction. You plan your entire morning around avoiding the massive wind tunnels. When you launch the boat, you do not just blindly head to your favorite spot from last fall. You adapt. You use the geography of the lake as a shield. You find the deep weed lines that are untouched by the surface chop. You find the steep rock bluffs that block the wind and create a pocket of glassy water. You start thinking like a fish that just went through the exhausting process of spawning. You ask yourself, where would I go if I wanted to rest, stay warm, and grab an easy meal without fighting a current? When you start asking the right questions, the lake opens up to you in a completely different way, and the old myths just fade away. The truth is, fishing knowledge evolves. We respect the old-timers, and we cherish the memories of learning to cast with our fathers and grandfathers. But blind obedience to old rules will leave your live well empty. The fish into the wind advice is a perfect example of a good idea applied at the completely wrong time of year. May fishing is about stability, warmth, clear water, and precision. The wind destroys every single one of those factors. It drops the temperature, muds up the water, ruins your casting accuracy, and stresses the fish out. The next time you are standing at the boat ramp and you feel that heavy spring breeze hitting your face, I want you to smile. Because while everyone else is going to turn their boats directly into the teeth of that chop, you know better. You are going to quietly slip into the protected waters. You are going to find the clear, warm, stable pockets where the big fish are actually hiding. You are going to fish smart, stay comfortable, and have the kind of day on the water that reminds you exactly why you fell in love with this sport in the first place. And there you have it. The biggest twist in spring fishing is that the wind is not always your friend, and sometimes completely ignoring your grandfather's golden rule is the exact secret to having the best day of your life on the water. Breaking away from the wind-blown banks gives you warmer water, better clarity, and the perfect conditions for the finesse presentations that May fishing demands. Thank you so much for watching. If this video gave you a new perspective on how to tackle your next fishing trip, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, and drop a comment below. I want to hear from you. What is the absolute worst piece of old-school fishing advice you ever received? Let us talk about it in the comments, and I will see you on the water.